What would you do if you saw a bomber coming in for landing, engines roaring, everything seemingly normal, and then realized there wasn't a single person on board? I'm about to tell you a story that still defies explanation even after all these years. A story about November 23rd, 1944, and a B 17 Flying Fortress that flew itself home while its entire crew vanished into thin air. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This happened, and nobody has ever figured out why. The morning started like any other combat mission day at RAF Chelveston in Northamptonshire, England. The 305th Bomb Group was preparing for another run over Belgium. These men had flown dozens of missions together. They knew the routine: pre-flight checks, briefings, equipment inspections. Everything systematic, everything by the book. By November 1944, the war in Europe had settled into a grinding rhythm. The Allies were pushing toward Germany, but the Luftwaffe still had teeth. Every mission carried risk. Every takeoff meant some crews might not return. B-17, number 42-97316, sat on the hard stand that morning, just another flying fortress among dozens. The B-17 was America's workhorse bomber, a four-engine giant that could take punishment and keep flying. Pilots loved it. Crews trusted it. The Germans feared it. This particular aircraft was relatively new, delivered earlier that year. It had flown numerous missions without significant problems. Nothing in its service record suggested anything unusual was about to happen. The crew assigned to fly her that day consisted of 10 men: a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. Standard configuration for a B-17 combat mission. These weren't rookies. They trained together stateside, crossed the Atlantic together, flown combat together. They knew their aircraft. They knew each other. They knew the dangers. The mission briefing revealed the target: a German military installation near Liège, Belgium. Not a milk run, but not a suicide mission either. Intelligence reported moderate anti-aircraft defense and possible enemy fighter activity. Weather forecasts predicted broken clouds over the target area, good enough for visual bombing. The crews would fly in formation, multiple squadrons combining their defensive firepower for protection. Standard doctrine, proven tactics, engines started around 700 hours. 4 Wright cyclone radial engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower, coughed to life one by one. The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunder that rattled windows and made conversation impossible without shouting. Ground crews performed final checks, pulling chocks, disconnecting equipment, clearing the aircraft for taxi, everything normal, everything routine. The B-17s lumbered toward the runway, heavy with fuel and bombs. Each aircraft carried up to 6,000 pounds of ordnance, depending on the mission profile and fuel requirements. The takeoff roll was always tense. Fully loaded, a B-17 needed every foot of runway to get airborne. Pilots held their breath until the wheels left the ground and the bomber transitioned from struggling truck to graceful aircraft. One by one, the flying fortresses clawed into the gray English sky, forming up into combat boxes, the tight formations that provided mutual defensive fire against enemy fighters. The flight to Belgium took about an hour. The bomber stream crossed the English Channel, a sight that never lost its impact. Dozens of aircraft, sometimes hundreds, all heading toward occupied Europe with enough explosive power to level cities. Fighter escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs wove protective patterns around the bombers. The Germans had learned to respect these formations. Attacking a well-defended bomber stream was dangerous work. even for experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Anti-aircraft fire greeted them over Belgium. The Germans called it Flak, short for Fliegerabwehrkanone, air defense cannon. The Allies just called it Hell. Black clouds of explosive fragments filled the sky at predetermined altitudes. The concussions buffeted the bombers. Shrapnel punched through aluminum skin. Sometimes the damage was superficial, sometimes it was catastrophic. Pilots couldn't evade. They had to fly straight and level through the barrage, maintaining formation, getting their bombs to the target. The bomb run itself was controlled chaos. Bombardiers took over, making fine adjustments to the aircraft's heading while peering through their northern bomb sights. When the lead bombardier released his bombs, the rest of the formation followed. Thousands of pounds of high explosive fell away. The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Below, explosions walked across the target area. Missions were measured in tons of bombs dropped, not in individual human consequences. The crews tried not to think about what was happening on the ground. Then something happened to B-17, number 4297316. Nobody knows exactly what. The aircraft was observed over the target area, and witnesses reported it appeared to take flak damage. Not catastrophic, nothing that suggested immediate disaster, but enough to cause concern. The bomber began losing altitude, falling behind the formation. In bomber combat, falling behind meant vulnerability. German fighters targeted stragglers. A lone B-17 was a gift. Standard procedure dictated that damaged aircraft tried to maintain formation as long as possible. If that became impossible, the pilot had options. Attempt to reach Allied territory, find a place to crash land or bail out. Head for neutral Switzerland or Sweden if feasible. As a last resort, ditch in the English Channel and hope for rescue. What pilots didn't do was abandon a flyable aircraft without good reason. B-17s were valuable. More importantly, they could get damaged crews home. The bomber continued flying roughly westward toward England and safety. Other crews in the formation lost visual contact as they turned for home. Nobody thought much about it initially. Damaged aircraft often made it back hours after the main formation landed. Ground crews were used to patching up shot-up bombers and sending them out again. The maintenance officers at RAF Charleston expected 4297316 would either make it home or they'd receive word it had crashed or the crew had bailed out over friendly territory. What happened next remains unexplained. The B-17 crossed back over the English Channel, flying steadily westward. The engines continued running normally. The aircraft maintained altitude and heading. It behaved like it had a competent pilot at the controls, making deliberate choices and adjustments. But at some point during that flight, possibly over Belgium, possibly over the Channel, possibly over England itself, every single member of the 10-man crew disappeared. The bomber reached the English coast and kept flying. It passed over villages and fields, engines droning steadily. People on the ground noticed it, just another B-17 heading home from a mission. Nothing unusual visible from below. The aircraft looked intact. It flew normally. No obvious damage, no trailing smoke, no signs of distress. Just another flying fortress going about its business. Then it began descending, not in a dive or a spin, not the characteristic plunge of an uncontrolled aircraft, a gradual, almost gentle descent, as if someone was carefully bringing the bomber down for landing. The descent rate was measured, controlled. The wings stayed level. The heading remained steady. Every indication suggested a pilot was flying the aircraft, preparing for an emergency landing in an open field. Witnesses watched the B 17 settle lower and lower. It cleared a row of trees, dropped below the ridge line, and disappeared. People waited for the explosion. Bombers carried fuel, ammunition, sometimes unexpended bombs. A crash usually meant fire and secondary explosions. But there was no explosion, no fire, just silence after the engine stopped. Curious locals and military personnel rushed to the scene. What they found was impossible. The B 17 sat in a Belgian field near the village of Corroy-le-Grand. The landing, if you could call it that, had been remarkably gentle. The bomber had obviously hit hard, the undercarriage had collapsed, and the fuselage showed impact damage, but the aircraft was fundamentally intact. No fire, no explosion. The wings were still attached. The tail section was bent but complete. For a bomber making an emergency landing without proper landing gear, it was almost textbook. The emergency crews approached cautiously. Unexploded ordnance was always a concern. Fuel leaks could ignite. But as they got closer, something seemed wrong, too quiet. No calls for help, no crew members emerging from the wreckage, no movement at all. They reached the aircraft and looked inside. Empty, completely empty. 10 men had taken off that morning. 0 men were aboard now. The investigation began immediately. First responders searched the wreckage thoroughly. Every compartment, every position. The pilot's seat, co-pilot's seat, navigator's station, bombardier's position, the radio operator's desk, the ball turret, the tail gunner's position, the waist gun positions. Empty. All of them. No bodies, no injured crew members, no one unconscious or trapped. Just 10 empty positions where 10 men should have been. Personal effects remained scattered throughout the aircraft. Flight jackets hung on hooks. Coffee cups sat in the navigator's compartment. The radio operator's logbook lay open on his desk, entries logged up to shortly before the bomber reached the English coast. Parachutes were found still in their storage positions. In the B 17, every crew member wore or had immediate access to a parachute. If the crew had bailed out, those parachutes should have been gone. The flight controls showed no signs of being locked or rigged for automatic flight. The autopilot system on a B 17 was rudimentary, capable of maintaining level flight in calm conditions, but nothing more sophisticated. It certainly couldn't execute a controlled descent and landing in a field. Someone had to be flying the aircraft during those final minutes, but no one was aboard when it stopped rolling. The engines were still warm when investigators arrived. 3 of the 4 engines had been running until impact. The 4th had apparently quit sometime earlier, possibly from battle damage over Belgium. Fuel remained in the tanks, enough to have flown considerably farther. The electrical systems were functional. The hydraulics worked. Nothing about the aircraft's mechanical condition suggested the crew had any reason to abandon it in panic. Most puzzling was the bomb load. B-17 bombers didn't return from missions with bombs aboard. The ordnance was either dropped on target or jettisoned safely over water or unpopulated areas before landing. Flying a damaged bomber back to base with a full bomb load was suicidally dangerous. A rough landing could detonate the bombs, vaporizing the aircraft and crew. But 42, 973, 1R6 still carried bombs in the bomb bay. Not a full load, but several thousand pounds of high explosive that somehow hadn't detonated during the landing. Military investigators descended on the site. This wasn't just a crash bomber. This was a mystery that violated everything they understood about aircraft operation and crew behavior. They interviewed witnesses who'd seen the bomber during its final approach. Everyone agreed the aircraft had been under control. The descent was deliberate. The approach was steady. It looked exactly like a pilot was bringing the bomber in for an emergency landing. Search parties spread out across the area. If the crew had bailed out, they had to be somewhere. Parachutes are visible from miles away. 10 men descending under canopy would have been noticed, but no parachutes were found. No crew members were found. No reports came in from local resistance fighters or civilians of American airmen hiding or seeking help. The crew had simply vanished. The investigation expanded to the flight path. Perhaps the crew had bailed out earlier, over the Channel or over Belgium. But that raised more questions. If the crew bailed out over enemy territory or water, who flew the bomber to England? If they bailed out over England, why were their parachutes still aboard? If they bailed at a high altitude, the bomber would have eventually lost control and crashed chaotically, not executed a controlled landing. Some investigators theorized the crew might have bailed out through the bomb bay while flying at low altitude. In theory, crew members could have jumped without parachutes into water, hoping to survive the impact. But the bomber had been flying over land when it went down. Jumping without parachutes on the solid ground meant certain death. Even desperate men wouldn't choose that. Besides, if they jumped into the channel earlier in the flight, that still didn't explain who piloted the aircraft afterward. The condition of the cruise stations provided more mysteries. Everything was neat and orderly. The pilot's controls were neutral. The co-pilot's seat was adjusted normally. The navigator's charts were spread out, clearly being used. The bombardier station showed no signs of panic or emergency. The radio operator's equipment was functioning, but the last log transmission had been routine, nothing suggesting distress. The gunners' positions were clean, weapons secured. Nothing indicated a sudden emergency that would cause the entire crew to abandon the aircraft simultaneously. Speculation ran wild. Some suggested enemy action had killed the crew of a Belgium, but that made no sense. If everyone was dead, who flew the bomber to England and executed the landing? Besides, the cruise station showed no blood, no battle damage that would have been fatal to men inside the aircraft. The B-17 was designed to protect its crew. Taking enough damage to kill everyone aboard typically meant the aircraft wouldn't remain flyable. Others proposed carbon monoxide poisoning. B-17s could develop exhaust leaks that flooded the cabin with odorless, deadly gas. Crews had succumbed to CO poisoning on previous missions, but poisoned crews didn't bail out. They lost consciousness at their stations. And even if somehow all 10 men realized they were being poisoned and decided to jump simultaneously, their parachutes would be gone and there would be evidence of their emergency departure. A few wild theories suggested the crew had been abducted or that the entire incident was staged for unknown reasons. These ideas gained no traction among serious investigators. The evidence didn't support exotic explanations. This was a straightforward mystery with straightforward facts that simply didn't add up to any coherent explanation. The official investigation eventually concluded with an unsatisfying result: cause unknown. The crew was listed as missing in action. Families received the dreaded telegrams, but without the closure of confirmed deaths or the hope of prisoners of war. Just missing. Gone. 10 men who took off on a routine mission and disappeared from a flying aircraft that somehow brought itself home. Over the decades, Historians and aviation enthusiasts have revisited the case repeatedly. New theories emerge periodically. Perhaps the crew bailed out over occupied Belgium and were immediately captured or killed, and the bomber flew on autopilot far longer than thought possible. Perhaps there was a fire or toxic fumes that forced everyone out, and coincidentally, the damage repaired itself or burned out. Perhaps one crew member stayed aboard initially, flew the bomber toward England, then bailed out at low altitude over the channel, and by pure chance, the bomber continued flying and landed itself. None of these theories withstand scrutiny. The evidence is too specific. The parachutes were still aboard. The aircraft was too controlled during the final approach. The mechanical condition was too good. Every explanation requires multiple improbable events happening in sequence, each one unlikely on its own. The simplest explanation that the crew remained aboard and died on impact was disproven immediately. The bomber was empty. The B-17 itself was eventually scrapped. Too damaged to repair economically, it was stripped for parts and recycled. The investigation files were classified initially, then forgotten in archives. The families of the 10 missing crew members mourned without answers. Some held out hope their loved ones had somehow survived, perhaps as prisoners who hadn't been properly documented. But none of the crew ever turned up. Not in POW camps. Not after the war ended. Not ever. Stories of the ghost bomber spread through military aviation communities. Pilots and crew members heard the tale and shuddered. Flying was dangerous enough without mysteries like this. The incident became a cautionary tale, though nobody could say what the caution was. Don't abandon your aircraft. But they hadn't. Stay with your crew. But they'd all disappeared together. Trust your equipment. But the equipment had worked perfectly. Similar incidents, though none quite as baffling, occurred throughout the war. Aircraft occasionally returned from missions with dead crew members at their stations, killed by flak or enemy fire. Bombers sometimes landed themselves after pilots were incapacitated, gliding down to rough but survivable crashes. But nothing matched the specific strangeness of 42-97316. An entire crew gone, an aircraft still flying perfectly, and landing that suggested someone was at the controls until the very end. Modern aviation experts examining the case find it no less mysterious than investigators in 1944 did. Aircraft systems haven't fundamentally changed the physical requirements of flight. A B-17 cannot fly itself, not really. The autopilot can maintain level flight but cannot navigate, cannot descend, cannot land. Those actions require human input. Yet somehow this bomber did all of those things with no one aboard. Some have suggested we're asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering how the bomber flew without a crew, perhaps we should ask when the crew disappeared. If they left the aircraft early in the mission, over Belgium perhaps, then most of the flight was indeed autonomous. The bomber could have flown westward on autopilot, gradually losing altitude as fuel burned and weight decreased. The final descent could have been a long, slow glide rather than a controlled landing. The relatively gentle impact could have been luck rather than skill. But this explanation still requires the crew to have abandoned a flyable aircraft for no apparent reason, leaving their parachutes behind and disappearing without a trace despite dozens of witnesses on the ground who should have seen them. It trades one impossible scenario for another. The truth is, we'll never know what happened aboard B-17 42-97316 on November 23, 1944. The crew took their secret with them wherever they went. The bomber kept its own secrets, sitting silent in that Belgian field before being scrapped and forgotten. All that remains are questions without answers and a story that refuses to make sense no matter how many times it's examined. 10 men climbed aboard a bomber one grey morning in England. They flew toward enemy territory, completed their mission, and then somewhere between Belgium and home, they ceased to exist aboard that aircraft. The bomber continued without them, crossed the channel, found England, descended, and landed itself with nobody at the controls. That's what happened. How it happened, why it happened, and where those 10 men went remains one of World War II's most enduring mysteries. This is the story. This is what the records show, what the witnesses reported, what the investigators found. A ghost bomber that landed itself while its entire crew vanished into history, leaving behind only questions and an aircraft that should not have been able to do what it did. If this story captured your imagination the way it's captured the imagination of aviation historians for 8 decades, share it. These mysteries deserve to be remembered, even if they can never be solved. These men deserve to be remembered, even though we don't know what became of them. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that refuse to give us easy answers, the ones that remind us that even in our documented, recorded, investigated world, some things remain unexplained.